The wise and humorous author Annie Lamott writes about deeply personal themes. From her battle with alcohol to her wrestling with how to live as a Christian, she walks the talk when she says that you own everything that happens to you. She says that she writes books that she needs to read, honest, concerned with the reality of life, the heart, spiritual transformation, families, secrets, wonders, craziness, and things that make one laugh. She says, when I am reading a book like this, I feel rich and profoundly relieved to be in the presence of someone who will share the truth with me and throw the lights on a little. I really appreciate her direct storytelling, her compassionate candidness, and her soft humor about sin and shame and the brokenness of life. With a touching kindness, she talks of the truth all of us have, of being messed up in our own unique and yet human ways. Lamott says everyone is screwed up, broken, clingy, and scared. Even the people who seem to have it more or less together. They are much more like you than you would believe. So try not to compare your insides to their outsides. You can't save, fix, or rescue any of them, or get any of them sober. But radical self-care is quantum and radiates out into the atmosphere like a breath of fresh air. It is a huge gift to the world. And when people respond by saying, well, isn't she full of herself? Smile obliquely like Mona Lisa and make both of you a nice cup of tea. I think our world needs to sit and share a cup of tea more than we do. Because deep down, she's speaking of shame. That little voice inside each one of us that whispers again and again that I'm not good or whatever enough. It's just under the surface for most of us. We compare ourselves to the outward appearance of others, and we long to see as we see others. You know, those folks more accomplished and happier, loved and richer, smarter, or more spiritual than we are. And we live with this deep conscious or subconscious fear of being disconnected. We think that to be connected to others without shame, to be loved and to have worth, that somehow we need to work harder, we need to be better, stronger, more self-assured, and self-reliant. Beloveds, the reality is that for connections to happen, we need to be vulnerable. We need to rely on grace and forgiveness. Because it is grace and forgiveness that takes away our shame and our fears, letting us know that we are loved and worthy, connected to God and community, no matter what. Sociologist Brené Brown spent 6 years researching shame. Think about that. 6 years researching shame. She found that those who feel connected have a strong sense of love and belonging. Not a surprise. And those who struggle with shame struggle to find and feel love and community. Because the people who feel loved and connected see themselves as worthy. Now, I didn't find any of that earth-shattering necessarily. But she goes on. What worthy people had in common was a sense of courage. Courage, a wonderful word. The root Latin of it comes from the word cur, meaning heart. These folks had courage or heart to be imperfect. They had the courage or heart to be compassionate and kind to themselves and to others, loving their neighbors as themselves. Now, Brown is not a theologian, but when I recognize loving our neighbors as ourselves, my ears perked up. You see, these folks let go of who they thought others wanted them to be, who that little voice in their head that said, you should be. And they gave themselves the freedom to be who they really were, who God created them to be. Children of God, made in God's own image. They fully embraced and believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. What makes us vulnerable makes us beautiful. This paradox of our human nature, vulnerable and beautiful, saint and sinner, this is who we are. This is who God made us to be, complex and messy individuals. But we are made and called to have heart and to be courageous. Both are necessary because we live in a world where there are no guarantees. We're called to be courageous and vulnerable. We're called to say, I love you first. We're called to invest in relationships regardless of how we think they might work out. Brown calls these folks wholehearted. We call them Christian, followers and disciples of Jesus the Christ, loving God and loving our neighbor as ourselves. People forgiven, people called to forgive. Annie Lamott says that forgiveness is giving up all hope of having a better past. Forgiveness is giving up all hope of having a better past. How often do we live in the past? How often do we wish away those things in our past that bother us, that keep us up at night, that bring us shame, that make us not feel courageous or connected or have worth? Our past is our past. Nothing can change that. Nothing can wish it away. But Jesus, through the cross, forgives us. Jesus takes on all of the sins and all of the messiness of our past and gives us, through these living waters, new life each and every day. But we look into our reflection and we see dark shadows, or we see those things from our past that haunt us. We hold on to those sins and shame from the past, and we're not alone. Did you know that we, gathered, adults in this country, are the most in-debt, obese, addicted, and medicated in all history, across all time? We don't want to feel vulnerable, and so we numb our shame and we ignore that people and the parts of our lives that need forgiveness. We retreat. We build walls. We kick and we scream. We oppress and we bully. And we suppress our shame, and in our selfish attempt to forget our past sins, we blame. There's always someone to blame. Sometimes it's easier to blame others than to blame and forgive ourselves. We live in a world that no longer can sit in conversation civilly. All we can do is point fingers and hold signs and march and fight and blame. Blame, as Brené Brown says, is defined as the way to discharge pain and discomfort. And religion and politics are at their worst about blame. And at our own personal worst, we see things as only black or white, good or bad, people as in or out, with us or against us. And we feel this discomfort and anger and pain, and so we continue to blame. And when we feel that discomfort and shame, or feel like we're getting too close to love or connectedness with others, we see ourselves as saints and others as sinners, and we blame and we distance ourselves and sometimes disconnect ourselves from community and from the source of grace and forgiveness, the very gifts and the tools that God gives us. I'm a huge fan of the Serenity Prayer. And I know that I've shared the other Serenity Prayer from the pulpit before, but it speaks to me this day very powerfully. God, grant me the serenity to stop beating myself for not doing things perfectly, the courage to forgive myself because I'm working on doing things better, and the wisdom to know that you already love me just the way I am. This is an important prayer because forgiveness is hard. We struggle to love our neighbor as ourselves. We struggle to love ourselves and our God. We struggle to forgive ourselves and our neighbor because, filled with fear and shame, we struggle to have the courage to forgive ourselves. You see, we're not unlike the disciples in our gospel today. When Peter asks about the limits of forgiveness, when Peter, feeling shame and fear, wants to wave the finger of blame or quickly forgive, Jesus responds. He responds as he always does with a story that is a parable and confuses us sometimes. But this story suggests that human forgiveness should mirror the unlimited mercy of God, not the words that Peter or many of us want to hear when it comes to forgiveness. Because we wrestle not with the very heart of God, but we focus and we wrestle with the fairness of it all. And we judge. And we don't think it's fair that some people are forgiven. Take on the role of God when we do that. And the reality is that our sense of justice can be frightening. Our hearts are hardened, even though we are loved just the way we are. We have all been granted mercy on top of mercy. And just as God's abundance flows in creation, I'm not sure they're still there, but this morning, our 8 o'clock group had a hard time gathering. You see, overnight on the ramp and in the little covering to this wing's entrance, an army of spiders had woven webs. They were beautiful. They were stunning. Some looked like picture-perfect Halloween cards. Others were draped like great suspension bridges, and they all dripped and glistened in the fog with the dew, with the abundance of God's creation. And there was not God or a spider in sight, but they were fully present. It's that abundance that we walk right by. It's that abundance that we dismiss out of hand. It's that abundance when in our fear and our shame and our inability to forgive that we miss completely. That same abundance are found in these waters. That same abundance in this table where forgiveness is given whether we deserve it or not. We beg with our hands open, and God acts and forgives us despite our fear and shame. Despite our hardness of heart, despite how stingy we are with forgiving ourselves or others, God's grace and forgiveness is unconditional, and there is enough to go around. Beloveds, God calls us to turn away from the ways that we interact with ourselves and the world and to practice forgiveness. To see it as a response to God's gift of grace and abundance all around us. A colleague of mine uses the image of the time-out parenting tool. Now, I'm too old for my parents to have used that modern version of discipline in our home. And I'm not a parent, so I've never had to enact a time-out. but it fascinates me. I mean, as a kid, I never got the blessing of solitude away from my brother and sisters who I wanted to strangle, or who maybe I had pushed around a little bit or said mean things to. Yeah, sure, every once in a while I got sent to my room, but actually that was a blessing because I shared a room with my brother, and if I got sent there, he wasn't going to be there. So this timeout concept, even if a kid is kicking and screaming going into it, it's not a punishment for the child. It is a blessing for the parent. It's a blessing for the parent, not because the kid is locked away or not bothering you anymore, but because it gives you time. I think we all need to take timeouts more and more. It gives us time while the child is figuring out what they've done wrong. It gives the parent time to regroup and figure out what's next. It allows parents to ponder how to act when the timeout ends, allowing anger and blame to be tempered by time and faith. Do we end it out of anger, physical discipline, raised voices? Do we see things calmly, as if we've sat with a cup of tea? I think that's what Jesus is doing when the disciples asked, "How many times, Jesus, are we supposed to forgive these people?" It's because God has broken into our brokenness. It's because our past has been nailed to the cross that Jesus responds by saying, "You need to forgive a lot. Forgive a lot, over and over again." And that's hard for us to do. But if you leave with nothing else today, I want you to remember that while it's hard for us to forgive, it is not for God. And God forgives you again and again and again. When we get right down to it, this forgiveness thing is right in our face every day. We screw up, and God welcomes us back. We miss opportunities like those spider webs, and God offers us more and more and more. We go one way, and God pulls us back, inviting us to go another way. We react with anger, and God responds with a timeout of grace. We fight, and God gives us Jesus. We embrace sin, and we are forgiven. And when we doubt, and oh, how we doubt, God pursues us, and God fills us with the Holy Spirit of God to accompany us, to give us faith, to remind us of grace and forgiveness that never ends.